I've also got to try to remind myself to keep an eye on my time,
Okay.
because anyone who's already on this who knows me knows I talk a lot. So I can forget myself and go on and on.
Well, I'll also monitor just because as we get questions and then as we get closer, I mean, it goes till 4:30. That is the planned time.
Right.
So I'll give you a 10-minute warning or something if.
Yeah, I'd like to leave at least 15 minutes for questions, because I think there may be a lot of them because of the amount of ground I'm trying to cover. And I'm sure there will be lots of questions outside the scope of what I talk about. So
Do you want questions ongoing, or would you rather wait till the end?
I think if there are questions related to what I've just said, I would like to take them straight away.
That's what I would think.
Be easier to tackle them immediately. So yeah, just interrupt me if you see something in the chat. Perfect. Or the Q&A.
Great, great. Yeah, it is weird not to be able to like interact with the other folks that are on.
Yeah. Yeah, I discovered that the first time I did one of these versions, and it is very different when you don't see all the faces.
It is. Here we have 14 in so far.
Oh, I see a familiar name there. Hi, Pierce.
Yeah, people, as you come on, if you want to, just state your name in the chat and say hello and your class year or where you're coming from, that would be fabulous. It's really fun to do that. So we invite and welcome that.
Oh, good. Pierce is going to keep me honest too.
Welcome, Linda, Isabel. It's great.
We've got a really nice spread of class years already.
Yes, again, welcome everybody. My name is Nancy Stansberry and I'm a member of the advancement team. And Jim's going to introduce himself, but again, we're welcoming everybody. You can, again, join into the chat and share your name, class year, where you're from. We're up to 32 people or attendees. Some of you might be in groups together or couples, so that's great too. You want to go ahead, Jim, and get started, at least introducing yourself, and
Sure.
since you're going to have lots to share, might as well keep moving forward. I'm sure people are excited to get started.
Sure. So
We are
welcome,
recording this
everybody.
session.
My name is Jim Granser, and I am the college archivist here at Dickinson. I'm also a Dickinson graduate, class of '93. So I have the great pleasure of working for my alma mater. And in the 4 short years that I was a student, there's so many things you don't learn about Dickinson. And so I'm really excited by the fact that every day in my job, I learn a little something more about Dickinson College. And so opportunities like this are always great fun because I get to share what I know. And usually in the course of preparing for a talk like this, I also learn a few new things along the way too. And I always tell people one of the best parts about my job is that I literally do learn something new every day, because every day we're getting questions, not just from alumni and other people on campus, but from people all over the world who discover they have a family member who went to Dickinson College, or they're doing research on something else where Dickinson College just happens to have something in the rare books collection that we take care of here in the archives, or any number of other research areas. So events like this are both another learning opportunity for me, because I have to bone up on things to get ready, but also usually those of you who are attending share some new things with me too. I look forward to hearing if there's anything that you know that I don't know, because I wasn't here for all of these times. I just look it up. So this format's a little bit different. What I usually do is a walking tour of campus where I talk about the history of the college and weave into that walking tour the history of the buildings and how the campus itself has changed over time. So I'm doing my best to recreate that in a virtual fashion. On the bright side, I don't have to yell above the sound of the traffic driving by High Street. On the downside, I can't point directly to this building or that building, but you've been on campus, so you remember where things are basically, and I will occasionally go back to a map just to reorient us all, particularly when I talk about spaces and buildings that are not there anymore, but were 100 years ago, to give you a better sense of where that fits into Dickinson's overall history. Also, as I speak, if you have a question about something that I've just said, feel free to post something in the Q&A or the chat straight away so that we don't forget it. But if it's a question totally unrelated that you're still curious about, we'll address those at the end. And I want to leave plenty of time for a Q&A at the end, because I expect there will be quite a few questions. In trying to frame 200 plus years of history within the space of 90 minutes, it's quite a challenge. So I hope you'll bear with me if I'm speaking a little quickly at times, but we do have a lot to cover. So I'm going to start first by sharing my computer screen to show you all the Dickinson Archives website. So if you have not visited our website before, this is where we try to post information about the history of Dickinson College, as well as a sampling of photographs and artifacts and videos and documents and things of that nature. So anytime you're curious about a piece of Dickinson history, this is the best go-to starting point. This is as close as you come to a Dickinson Wikipedia. And the address is just archives.dickinson.edu, so it's real easy to remember. And if you look along the left-hand side for our menu here, you'll see there are guides to collections, full text documents, photos and images, audio-visual materials, artifacts. So down here under college history projects, we have the Encyclopedia. And the Encyclopedia is just a few important buildings, people, clubs, and organizations. It's not by any means comprehensive, but it reflects some figures in Dickinson's history that students had researched as part of history classes in years past. Students who worked for Archives and Special Collections might have done some research on campus buildings. So for most campus buildings, you can find a simple entry like this that tells you when the structure was built, who might have donated money for it, who was the architect, and usually there's a photograph associated with it. So I encourage you to check out the Dickinson Encyclopedia as a possible first stop for finding historical bits that you're curious about. You can go to the Photos and Images archive, named in honor of Pierce Bounds, who was a longtime campus photographer and member of the class of 1971. And here you can see there's lots of different ways to browse. So you can look for specific buildings and spaces. You can look for examples of photos from different campus events. And there's no shortage of fun images here that span the full history of the college. We also have an audiovisual collection. This is a somewhat smaller collection at the moment, but we're continuing to add more things to it. So the earliest film footage we have of commencement dates from 1928. We have, since we're going to be talking about physical buildings on campus, we have some footage of the building of Dreyer Hall here. We've got the Men's Glee Club here. I know we don't have, because we're virtual, we don't have a Men's Glee Club concert to enjoy for this year, but we can still listen to their recording from 1953. So this is another place on our website where you can see some of the audio and video of the college's past. So I wanted to make you aware of that because a lot of other questions you might have, you might be able to answer through that website. So now I'm going to move on to sharing from my camera. So now we're going to step into Dickinson history, and we're starting with this particular document. So usually I would start the walking tour. We would be standing near the Benjamin Rush statue, and that's often a good place. And for those of you who haven't been back to campus since the Benjamin Rush statue was installed in the early 2000s, the statue is located near the corner of East College on the West College side. So it's pretty central to the academic quad. So typically when I start my talk, I begin by saying that when Dickinson College was first founded, it was not located in that space at all. So there were a group of town fathers, if you will, who wanted to establish a school in Carlisle. And in 1773, they secured a plot of land in town from Thomas and John Penn, sons of William Penn. And the plot of land was located between Pomfret Street and the alley that runs between Pomfret and High Street. So if you imagine where the new courthouse is, and there's that alley that comes to the right-hand side of the courthouse, if you're looking at the courthouse, if you go down that alley almost to the end where you're almost at Bedford Street, the second plot of land in from Bedford Street is where this particular deed grants a plot of land. And so a school was going to be built there. Because of the Revolutionary War disruptions, they did not start to build that school until the early 1880s. And it was at that time that a man named John Montgomery was visiting a friend in Philadelphia, William Bingham, happened to be a very wealthy merchant, and was going to ask him about helping to fund this new school. And at the time John Montgomery paid a visit, Benjamin Rush happened to be visiting there as well. And when Montgomery told Rush about the plan for the new school, Benjamin Rush enthusiastically said, really, we need more than just grammar schools. We need institutions of higher learning. Why don't you establish a college? And so there in 1881 is where the idea for Dickinson College was born. And over the course of 2 years, John Montgomery, Benjamin Rush, and others drummed up support, put together a board of trustees, and then the college was officially chartered in September of 1783. So at that time, that school building, very basic school building on that part of town, that was the only building for campus. And it didn't take long before that space became a little too crowded. And so the Board of Trustees were looking for space to expand. And this is a separate deed. This is from John and Richard Penn. So we have one of the same sons, but now another son, Richard, granting the plot of land. And this is the roughly 7 acres that we think of as the academic quad today, bounded by High Street, West Street, Lowther Street, and College Street. So this deed is dated July 25th, 1799, which is down there at the bottom. There it is. And so this is the beginnings of Dickinson College on the campus that we're familiar with today, is acquiring that plot. And the building construction started almost immediately upon acquiring the land, and they were working on that building for several years, and they were just getting ready to open that new building when disaster struck. In February of 1803, the college building that had been under construction for nearly 4 years burned down. There was a violent winter storm, and it's believed that wind blew ashes from a unattended fire and caused the building to go up. And so right after the burning of that earlier building, the trustees immediately committed to rebuilding on the same site, and they invited Benjamin Latrobe to design a new building for the college. We have one item in our artifact collection, which we believe is a brick that remains from the building that burned on that site. This brick was dug up on campus in later years, and it is believed that the academic quad was not originally as flat as it was now. So this brick was used in part to help grade and flatten the campus, and it was dug up during another building project. So we think this is one tangible reminder of the building that preceded Old West. But in 1803, Benjamin Latrobe submitted his drawings free of charge to Dickinson College, and we see here the original sketch that he submitted for the north facade. So this is the side we don't really think of very often, the view that you have if you're standing on Lowther Street. But this was the first proposed view from that side, and here is the lower level, the basement level for the building. So these original sketches from 1803 have managed to survive now more than 200 plus years. So it was Benjamin Latrobe's idea to use limestone. The original building that Old West replaced was faced with brick. But Latrobe, in a lengthy letter, explains why he thinks limestone will be a better source to use. He said, it's plentiful in your part of the state. So it'll be easily quarried and it'll age beautifully over time. It'll give the college an appearance of strength and solidity. And so it is those words from Benjamin Latrobe which basically set the college on its familiar facade theme that we see throughout our campus today. So Old West, the great thing about Old West is you can show a photo of Old West from most any point in history and it looks much the same as it does today. This is the earliest known photograph of Old West. It dates from about 1860 or 1861. And again, it's a very familiar site. When you look at it, you recognize immediately there's no major changes. A few things about Old West that did change over time. So for many years, the western side of Old West served as a residence for a faculty member. So here we see in the later 19th century that there's quite a nice porch on that side. This area, often there are photographs that show a fence as well, a fenced-in garden area. So seeing that large covered porch is something that we're not used to. And here is another view of Old West from the other side. And again, you can see it's a pretty large porch even on the other side. Whereas today we're more familiar with just the simple set of stairs on the sides of the building. So in this time, in the early 1800s, Old West is our only college building, and they would not have called Old West Old West. They would have just known that building as the college. And Dickinson College in those early years had a number of financial difficulties. And there was a lot of back and forth. There was state support that would come for a period of time, and then that might dry up, and then someone might pass some additional legislation. There were other troubles on campus. There was one student who killed another student in a duel in 1815. That'll get you some bad press. The student who did the killing was actually a grandnephew of Thomas Jefferson, and he fled to Europe. So those kinds of scandals led to Dickinson College actually closing its doors in 1816, reopened in the early 1820s, continued to have financial troubles, and closed again in 1832. I've glossed over a lot of interesting history, but that will be for another presentation someday. So in 1833, the members of the Philadelphia Conference of the Methodist Church, as well as the Baltimore Conference, got together and said, we know the school was forced to close due to financial troubles. We at the Methodist Church would like to take over management of Dickinson College. And so they were given permission to do so. The existing Board of Trustees resigned en masse, and a new Board of Trustees was installed. And the first thing the new Board of Trustees did was authorize building a new structure to expand the school. So East College, there's a bit of a glare there, but East College was then built. And so once East College is built, now you have the two buildings in relation to one another. So prior to 1835, they would have just called West College Dickinson College. But once we had two buildings, they would have called one West College and this one East College. When East College was built, the area on the far eastern side was where the president of the college lived. Each of the different sections of the building, you see there's four different doorways. Each of those doorways opened to a separate part of the building with solid stone firewalls in between each section. So you could not get from one side of the building to the other without walking outside the building. And that was meant to be a safety measure if there was ever a fire, that it could be more easily contained to just one section of the building. So that's how East College was designed. And it continued to be a space that was both living space for students. There were some classrooms, and there was also the president's house. So in this image, you can actually see there's a bigger porch and a finer doorway on the side where the president lives. And by the 1950s, you'll see that the building had become, they no longer had the stairways that went up to the second level. They had everybody entering the building at ground level, and the building had become ivy covered by the mid 20th century. And this is a little out of our timeline, but I want to stick with this building because this is a fun story. So we always talk about East College being the second oldest building on campus, but that's a little bit of a cheat and a lie. So East College underwent a major renovation in the late 60s and early 70s. And part of that renovation was removing those solid stone firewalls between each section, because it was a great inconvenience to have to leave the building out of one door and enter again through another door. So, so those walls were removed, but the intention was to keep the exterior walls up and maintain that original facade. Unfortunately, the supports for those exterior walls was not strong enough, and overnight one night, the building, the remaining walls collapsed in. So thankfully nobody was hurt, but it did mean now we just had a pile of rubble and a hole in the ground. And so the building, they went back to the designs, made some alterations, and rebuilt East College, still on the same footprint and still in very much the same style and look, so that when you look at a photo of the rebuilt East College like this one, you have to look really closely to find the differences. So they did a very good job of keeping the exterior looking very much like the original building. But as I said, it's a bit of a cheat to call it the second oldest building on campus. It uses the stone that had been the facade for the building that was originally built in the mid 1830s, but the entire structure was basically rebuilt from the ground up. And right up until that late 60s, early 70s renovation, East College continued to house students. So it wasn't until that renovation that it finally started to be used exclusively as an academic building. So about the same time that East College is built, the college also acquires a building across the street from West College, and it became known as South College. This had originally been owned by a German Reformed Church congregation in Carlisle. That congregation had moved elsewhere, and so this building was sitting empty. And so this building served as the continuing of the preparatory school that had been associated with Dickinson all the way back to the founding of the grammar school. So that idea of having some students who are in the secondary school age group and a prep school that would sort of feed students into the college, that had been around since the late 1700s and into the 1800s. So South College underwent an expansion. later in the 1800s, so they added a floor. So this is South College getting into the later 1800s. And here's another view of South College. And I've mixed in a couple of winter scenes to remind us all that seasons do change. And while it's very hot in Carlisle right now, it's going to be cold again in another 6 months. So that's South College. So we've got our compass points. We've got West College, we've got East College, we've got South College. And yes, in fact, there was a North College. I know you're all thinking it. So if we look at our map, so we've got West College right here. We've got East College here. South College would have been located here. Well, there was a North College that was located just north of West College. It's basically where the parking lot to West College is now. That building was built around the 1820s and was partly coal storage. There were some spaces there that certain years students would take up. Like if there was a student who knew how to repair shoes, he might be given that space to pursue his trade and work on students' shoes for them and earn a little pocket money at the same time. So the North College building existed until the 1850s, but it burned down in 1856 and was never rebuilt. But there was a period of time when we had an East College, North College, South College, and West College. So yes, we had all of the compass points represented. So that was the campus. Those buildings basically defined Dickinson College up through the Civil War years. And during the Civil War years, some of you may be aware that the Confederate forces did come up through the Cumberland Valley. They did camp on the Dickinson College grounds, and the campus was spared, thankfully. There was shelling of the town of Carlisle after the Confederates had left. There was a unit of cavalry who came back around and actually fired upon the town. And so there was some minor damage. Some of you may remember that there's a chip out of pillars of the old courthouse, and they're marked with 1863 as the year of the shelling. But by and large, the campus remained unscathed. And it was in that post-Civil War period that we really started to see some growth of the campus as that next generation reached college age. So we had a spurt of building projects on campus that were a part of that expansion. So, and these three buildings came right on top of each other. So the campus must have been bustling with construction activity right around 1885, 86. So this was the first purpose-built gymnasium for the school. You can see Old West over here on the side. So this gymnasium was built roughly where North College used to be, and it was completed about 1885. So this was the first gym, and it also became the first time that there were actually gym classes, part of the hygiene program, and that's what the interior of the gymnasium looked like. So this is the first time that students had a space to practice for their different activities and have regularly held gym classes. Just about the same time that they're building the gymnasium, they build the first purpose-built science building. And this is known as the Tome Science Building. Jacob Tome was a member of the Board of Trustees, and he was from Port Deposit, Maryland, and he had pledged, I think, $25,000 toward the building of Tome, so the building bore his name as well. And interesting fact about Tome, so it was built specifically as a science building, and it was in operation as a science building until about 1999, when the physics department moved from Tome into the new science building, and they moved the name along with it. So so that building housed science for more than 100 years, and at the time, in the late 1990s, it was the longest continuing operation of a science building. But I did want to share, this was an earlier architect's conception for the building that, of course, didn't come to pass. And you can see they had a library planned in there, and quite a interesting looking structure, but not really in keeping with the Dickinson aesthetic. It would have looked rather out of place on the campus. And this is what the floor plan, zoom out a little bit, what the floor plan would have looked like. And so you see some of the ideas were kept. So this idea of a central hall, that area was still maintained as a central hall in the new building, and having rooms and offices along that front side was also maintained. But the overall shape of the building was changed quite a bit in later designs. But I always think it's interesting to look at building ideas that never came about. I actually forgot to share with you, here's another building plan that never came to fruition. This was one of the early designs for East College, which has a little bit more of a Gothic look to it as well, with the spires and columns. But again, that was not the final design for the building. So we have the old gymnasium, we have the Tome building, and the third building added at that time is Basler Hall. And for many of you, this particular image of Basler may look very different from what you were expecting. When Basler Hall was first built, it again had much more of a Gothic architecture feel to it, with the rounded turrets. And it was, instead of being faced with limestone, it was faced with red sandstone, often referred to as a brownstone. And likely all came from the Hummelstown Brownstone Company just across the river. That was one of the largest suppliers of red sandstone for building projects in this region of the country.
Jim, there's a question that I thought was relevant. Is there now, and has there always been, an architectural design review committee for the college?
I think each project has typically had its own committee. In the 19th century, I think it was basically the Board of Trustees, and there was always an executive committee of the Board of Trustees made up of more of the local members of the board and the president of the college to handle a lot of those kinds of things. But when new buildings were typically built in the 20th century, particularly once you get to the post-World War II period up through the present, there's typically a separate committee just for that building. And oftentimes it's a mix of faculty, administrators, and trustees. Faculty who are, if it's an academic building, you're going to want to involve the faculty who are going to be teaching in that building so they can talk about the elements of the design that are important to the teaching, and so forth. So each building typically has its own committee involved in the design process.
Great. I have one other question from someone. I thought I saw the word museum at the bottom of the Tome building drawing. Did Dickinson have a natural history museum? And also, what is it Tome called today, and what is it used for?
The original Tome building today is known as the Stern Center. So after the new science building was built and the Tome name was moved to the new science building in 1999, the older building was fully renovated, and the Mark and Ava Stern Foundation provided funding for that to turn it into our global center. And that's why that middle area, again, they kept that middle area as a great hall, and that is the Stern Great Hall to this day, where often speaking events are held. But in the original, when Tome first opened in the late 1800s, they did have a natural history and science museum. It had natural history specimens that had been collected at the college over the years and donated by alumni and trustees. There was a naval commodore who had ties to Carlisle and who was on the board of trustees, who donated many things from around the world from his travels. There were mineral specimens, there were plant and animal specimens, you name it. And we have in our archives some of the museum ledgers when people would make donations of examples of different kinds of rocks or things of that nature. So that was specifically set aside as a museum space in that early building. And even things like Joseph Priestley's scientific apparatus, it would have been held in that space in the late 1800s in through the middle of the 20th century. So with Basler looking very different from the other buildings on campus, it was in the late 1930s that someone said, you know, it really doesn't seem to fit being on the academic quad. So in 1940, they started to transform Bosler Hall from a building faced with red sandstone to a limestone faced building. So here you can see where they've taken off that front section of the entryway and the rounded turrets. And here it is then covered in scaffolding, and you can see the pediments at the top, and they're starting to transform it into the kind of limestone face structure we're familiar with today. And there is the final product, the Basler that we're all familiar with. And this is another building for which we do have some original film footage of the transformation. So it's not available on our website yet, but it will be sometime soon. It's really wonderful to watch the workmen, and it's amazing to see how challenging that kind of working on buildings that size was in those days. Seeing the classic ditch digger and steam shovels at their best. So
Jim, I just have one other question still related to the Tome Museum and curiosity about the exhibits and Joseph Priestley's equipment.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to those exhibits and the Joseph Priestley's equipment? I think maybe you spoke to that, but is there anything else to add?
Well, the Joseph Priestley equipment, when actually this goes right back to this building. Now that I think about it, perfect timing. So when they renovated Basler Hall, they built what they called the Boyd Lee Spar special collections room. So this was the first time that there was a dedicated space, because Bosler Hall served as the campus library. So that was the first time there was a dedicated space for the older rare books and other special materials. So there was actually film footage of them taking Joseph Priestley's burning glass from the old Tome building and putting it on a wheelbarrow and wheeling it across campus and up into Bosler Hall, into the new Boyd Lee Spar Special Collections room. So the Joseph Priestley equipment is kept to this day in Archives and Special Collections. So whenever you're next on campus, come on down to Archives and Special Collections, and you can see the pieces of the Joseph Priestley lab equipment that we still hold here. Included is a burning glass, 2 telescopes, and an air gun, among some pieces of glassware and other things. So we have a number of other older science pieces as well down here. So some things that would have been actively used science equipment in the 18th and 19th century have been donated to the archives for preservation and display ever since. So that building spurt, that period of the college's history post-Civil War was one particular growth spurt that maintained steady growth at the college for a number of years. At the same time that those new building projects started, a new president to the college arrived, and his name was George Reed. And when Reed arrived, he said, I don't really relish the idea of living in that eastern section of East College, immediately adjacent to all of the students also living in East College. So he asked the college to acquire the house across the street in 1890, which the college did. And here we see that house just as some renovations were being completed on it. Interestingly, the person who built this house also had the last name Reed, but had no relation. So this house was built in the 1830s by John Reed. And John Reed was president judge of the 9th Judicial District here in central Pennsylvania. And John Reed is the person who, when he took that role, he approached the new board of trustees of Dickinson College, the new leadership under Methodist auspices. And he said, you know, I'd like to teach law classes. Could I do so through the college? And so they agreed, and the agreement was basically Judge Reed would teach his classes to law students, and when they completed the law program, they would receive a Dickinson College diploma. And in return for Dickinson College essentially being the certifying institution for the teaching that John Reed was doing, Dickinson College undergraduates were permitted to take his law classes as well. And those classes, all of the law classes, were typically taught in his house. So this house is kind of the birth of the Dickinson School of Law, and why the law school, even though it was sort of a separate institution, why it bears the Dickinson name. And one of the things you can see in this photo is this stonework here in the foreground. So at the same time that that George Reed moves into this house, they also start building a church, a new Methodist church, right next to the president's house. And so we'll come back to that in just a moment. So the president's house then undergoes a renovation in the 1920s to add other floors. So there's an expansion of the house. And you can see now there's a little bit of, you can see the church right there, right next to the house. And another subsequent renovation brought the house looking like this instead. So instead of the more Tudor kind of style, we now stucco the outside, and now also you no longer see that church over on the other side. So those are the transformations for the president's house over time. But here is the church that used to sit right next to the house. And you really can't even see because of this angle, but the president's house is tucked back in there. This house that you can see more clearly was a different house that was actually a fraternity house for many years. But it's always remarkable to me to see how large that church was, and when you look at the historic president's house today and think about the fact that there was this large church between it and West Street. The church looks so imposing in the photos. It's a place that's no longer there, that it's hard to believe it ever was there. This is a photo that we have from the fire that destroyed that church in 1954. So it was after that fire that they decided to build the new church over where we're familiar with it, Allison Methodist Church, which is now Allison Hall. So there they are putting the framing up for the spire. So this photo dates from about 1956 then. So in this period, we still see that the campus is pretty much limited to the academic quad. So we've got this space here. We've got Old West, we've got East College, we've got Tome, we've got Bosler. We've got South College is still there serving as a prep school. The president's house has now been added. There's a big church right here between the president's house and the corner. But that still basically defines the entire Dickinson College campus. So the next building to be added is the one building that they allow to continue to be faced with something other than limestone, and that's Denny Hall. So here is Denny Hall as it was first built in 1896. And again, looking very different from other buildings on campus, but at the same time, it looks very much in the style that Basler Hall was built in only 10 years earlier. So at the time, I think those two buildings were thought of as nice bookends for the campus. And so that probably played into the decision to go with this kind of design. But as is often a danger, Denny Hall did suffer a fire and burned down in 1904, March of 1904. So back to the drawing board. It is thought that it was faulty electrical wiring. The fire started up in the upper floors, and they were able to salvage quite a bit from the building before all of it was lost. But so things like professors' desks and books and things like that, they were able to get out of some of the lower floors. But most of the Union Philosophical Society's materials, Union Philosophical Society and the Bell-Lettre Society, if we go back to this photo, so they had their halls in these upper floors, and UPS was here on the High Street side, and Bell-Let Society Hall was on the other end. And the fire started on this end of the building. So most of the records of the Union Philosophical Society were destroyed in the fire. But we have a lot of the original records of the Bell-Let Society because they were able to get things out of that side of the building before it was completely lost. So this was the getting ready to lay the cornerstone for the new Denny Hall, which was built on the same site. That is President Reed right there. This is Horatio Collins King, who was the college marshal at the time, member of the Board of Trustees and a graduate of the class of 1858.
Jim, there was a question. Can you speak to where students lived during this time period? What were the residence accommodations for students?
At this time, students are still living almost exclusively in East College and West College. The only exception to that is in the 1880s, we first started admitting women to the college. So our first women enrolled in 1884. And in those first few years, they would typically find a place to room with a family in town. And in the early 1890s, there was a house on Pomfret Street known that was called Landis House. No, not Landis House. Name just jumped out of my head. Anyway, that was the first house where the female students lived, and it was just a block from campus. And in a moment, I'll be getting to the next place that the women students were living. But through the 19th and early 20th century, students were overwhelmingly still living in East College and West College. There were lots of student rooms in those buildings. And the fraternities are just starting to come to the point of owning and maintaining their own houses. I should also mention when Denny Hall was first built, that's where the main administrative offices were. So the president's office, dean's office, those would have been in Denny, not in Old West at that time. So this is the Denny Hall as it was rebuilt. So it doesn't bear quite the same Gothic stamp that its predecessor had, but in many ways it still resembles it. The new Denny was actually a bit larger as well. And they continued to have halls on both ends. So Union Philosophical Society, again, was on this end, Bell-Let Society on the other end. This building had the addition of a clock tower, which was named for William Clare Allison. He was also a member of the Board of Trustees, and the church that was on the opposite corner was also the Allison Memorial Methodist Church. So Mr. Allison was a generous donor to building projects of that era. And this is an example of one of those student halls. I honestly am not sure if this is the Bell-Let Society or the Union Philosophical Society. I tend to think it's the Union Philosophical Society just because of the amount of light coming through the windows. So I'm guessing that those are the lights facing to the south, because I'm not sure if this were the Bell-Let end, if you would get that much light shining through. But that gives you an idea of the space. And for those of you familiar with the interior of Denny Hall after the 1980s renovation, this is the room known today as room 317 that has that kind of grand arrangement and that stained glass still in that space. Now, at the time they built Denny Hall, the time they built the second Denny Hall, they were trying to raise money for that building project. And the college approached Andrew Carnegie, a pretty famous philanthropist, and asked him about donating. And he said he'd be happy to donate, but he only ever donates when he gets to name the building. And the Denny family had donated the land on the agreement that any building ever built on that site would bear the Denny family name. So we weren't able to name Denny Hall in whatever other name Andrew Carnegie would have wanted. But around the same time, we had built this building, which was a new building for the Dickinson Preparatory School. So that older South College building that you may recall had grown too small. And so this was the new expansion. And Andrew Carnegie was friends with Moncure Conway, Dickinson College class of 1849. And he wanted the building named in his honor. So so the college said, sure, we'll name that building, because up until that point, this building hadn't been named. It had only been completed about a year earlier. So this became Conway Hall, continued to house the school's Dickinson Preparatory School, and they started to just call the preparatory school Conway Hall. And the preparatory school then closed in 1918. And after it closed, then this building largely became a freshman male dormitory. And I always remember alumni, particularly alumni from the classes of the 1950s, remarking how much the building had been let go and it was in really poor shape. I think the term, it was a dump, was used on occasion. So apparently they didn't keep it up as well as they might. But going back to where the female residents of Dickinson College lived. So this is Metzger Hall. When George Metzger, who was also an alumnus of Dickinson College, he had become a lawyer and lived here in town. When he died, he left money to found a women's school. And so they opened a Metzger College, and it was located at the end of Hanover Street, basically where about 3 blocks down where Hanover Street takes a funny jog at an interesting angle toward the northeast. And so when I was a student, there was a Hardee's restaurant located right at that point. Today, there is Chen's Asian Cafe located there. But that is where Metzger Hall was located. So women of that era then had roughly half a mile walk to campus. So Metzger College, as an independent institution, only lasted about 20 years. But because Dickinson College started admitting women, and there were a number of other schools that admitted women in the area, Metzger College, as an independent school, couldn't really compete. So when the school closed, Dickinson College came to an agreement with the Metzger Trust that the college could lease the building basically, you know, for $1 a year. The college would assume responsibility for maintaining the building and all of that. So this became the women's primary dormitory, and also there was a dining hall in the Metzger building as well.
Hi, Jim, there was a
Yes.
question about Conway, if that building is still here or what happened with that building.
That building is not still here. Conway Hall, get my trusty map. So Conway Hall was located roughly where the Spar Library is today. So at that time, there were lots of individual houses on this block, but this space was empty. So, yeah, basically where the Spar Library and part of ATS, Anita Tubin Schlechter Auditorium, that's where Conway Hall was located. It was demolished finally in the early 1960s. And Metzger continued to be used up through the late 1950s. So right around, it might be the 60-61 school year, I think might have been the last year that Metzger Hall was used by the college, and then it was sold and demolished at that time. So quick mention of athletics. We don't want to forget about the athletics program. So this is the first athletic field. That's the grandstand, and the field looks like it's kind of a mess, just a lot of scrub and dirt. But this field was located up here. So where the Kaufman building is now, that is where that first athletic field was. And so they started using that athletic field basically when intercollegiate sports first started. So baseball and football are getting started in the 1880s, and that was where they practiced and played their games. And then Biddle Field, which we're all familiar with because that's been there now since 1909, Biddle Field came along, and its earlier orientation, the field was basically perpendicular to High Street, and then in a later change to the field in the 1960s so that the track around it could be of the proper length and dimension, they had to turn it at an angle. So this is the Biddle Field. We're more familiar with the orientation today, and also the expanded tennis courts at the same time. So that's just a quick mention of the athletics. And then in terms of the gymnasium, so we saw the older gymnasium before was behind Old West. In 1926, they start construction of a new gymnasium, and they demolish the old South College building. So this is right across the street from Old West. That's the construction. And that is the Alumni Gymnasium. Another winter shot for us to remind us of the cooler weather. So the Alumni Gymnasium opened in 1927. That's a view of the interior. And this gymnasium had a swimming pool. So that was the first time, 1927, that the college had its own swimming pool. And we'll come back to that building. That is the building that we know today as the Weiss Center. So we've still been mostly, with the exception of Conway Hall, we've been mostly on one side of College Street. But as we get deeper into the 20th century, the college starts to expand further. So one of the first properties we acquire is the land known as the Moorland Field. And it was also often referred to as the Deer Park. And Johnston Moore built his, it was referred to as a mansion. It's a sizable house, but mansion might be overstating it. But anyway, this house was located roughly where Whitware Hall is today. So this is giving you a sense of that long walk from, if you're standing down at High Street, looking up toward that hall. But the college acquires that piece of land in the early 1930s from Johnston Moore's surviving daughter, and they turn that building into Baird Biology Hall. So that becomes the biology building in the 1930s. And that building continues to be the home for biology until the Dana Biology Building is built in the early 1960s. So this is another building that no longer exists. This was then demolished to make way for Whitware Hall. Then we have our post-World War II boom. Now I'm going to go through a lot of buildings very quickly because not only are we running out of time, but it all happens very fast. So the post-World War II period, we have the GI Bill bringing a lot more people to college, and we just have overall growth of people of college age interested in attending college. So in a period of a generation, the college expands very quickly and adds lots of new structures. So the first is South College, the latest version of South College. So this is behind the Alumni Gymnasium off of the alley. And it's a building that was housing math and computer science when I was a student here, and now houses our IT departments for the campus. Then, far more importantly, the college finally builds a women's dorm in the center of campus. So on that piece of land where Baird Hall was located, now we build Dreyer Hall. And so this is President Adele breaking ground for the new women's dorm. And that is the completed Dreyer Hall, completed about 1951. So this is the first time the women have a place to live on the campus, not until 1951. I always stress that because that had to be a huge pain in the neck for the women who were at Dickinson College to have to travel all the way from Metzger Hall. And that's a view of the interior of Dreyer. And I always like this one because this whole idea of having the mail delivered directly to each individual building, of having a kind of receptionist and a desk there. There would have only been one phone for the entire building in those days. So very different way of living than we're accustomed to. So after Dreyer, then we need another men's dormitory because the student body keeps expanding. This is President Adele breaking ground for Morgan Hall in 1954. And this is a completed Morgan. This is the Moorland Avenue street side, and that's looking from the Benjamin Rush campus side. And I've got to get my other cart pulled up because we have lots of others. And then the year after that, we build Alt House. So we have growth in the academic program. So we build a building dedicated to the chemistry department, completed in 1957. So that gets added to the academic side. Then we have Adams Hall in the early 1960s. So that's breaking ground for Adams. And Adams was exclusively a women's dorm. So it was right next to Dreyer Hall on that same side of campus. So that is a completed Adams Hall. And there is Mr. and Mrs. Adams in front of the building they helped to fund. And then 1964, thanks in large part to a federal grant, the college builds the 10 quads, which were designed to house the 10 fraternities that were at the college at that time. So 10 identical buildings for each of the fraternities to occupy. They were all co-located on the same side of campus. And so there's the completed quad, and we can see Theta Chi's letters are on that building, which I would know as quad 2. So that's 64. And then at the same time, we have our first student union building. This is the architect's conception for the hub. And some early construction. And we can see Montgomery House there on the side, and there's a little bit of Conway Hall that you can see in the background there at that time. And there's our completed Holland Union building. And this is the view.
Just to note, there's about 20 minutes left. We're at 4:10.
Okay.
And Janet offered a question I thought was pretty interesting. She was asking about anything in the archives or historically that was documented around the 1918-19 flu pandemic. And is there anything planned around that history for 2020-2021?
Remind me of that again, because I can show a place on the website. So the shorter answer is there's almost nothing about the 1918 pandemic, which is very frustrating to find so little in the record. But we do have, we're able to be more proactive about recording what's going on at Dickinson College during this current pandemic starting last year. So I can show that on the screen.
Okay. Someone also asked, was Spar Library built in 1963? What was the year for that?
We're almost there, not
Okay.
63.
Thank you.
So yeah, the hub is 64. Then Malcolm Hall, dormitory built across the street from Morgan Hall. So this is the architect's artistry, and this is the completed building. And Malcolm Hall is where I lived during my sophomore year. So I will say it's not a great building, but it holds a special place in my heart. And then right after Malcolm, then Whitware Hall. So I mentioned it was located, it's located right next to Adams and between Adams and Allison, and Baird was demolished in order to make space for Whitware.
William asked where the students ate before the hub.
There were cafeterias. Well, I should say there were kitchens. So if you were in a fraternity, there you had your own kitchens and your own cooks. If you were one of the women students on campus and you lived at Metzger Hall had its own kitchen. When they opened Dreyer Hall, it had its own kitchen and cafeteria. Conway Hall maintained its own dining facility. So there were separate, it wasn't a centralized activity, dining on campus. And they would use the old gymnasium when they had really large gatherings. That was the one space that they could often use. Once they had built the Alumni Gymnasium, then they used that big empty space for when they had larger banquets, and dances for the campus could also be held in that space. But yeah, there were kitchens and dining facilities in buildings all over campus until they built the hub. And that was one of the other things with the new fraternity quadrangle, is they didn't have huge kitchens and dining facilities like they had enjoyed in their individual houses prior to that. So Malcolm, Whitware, and then we get to the Dana Biology Building also. So again, this is, can you imagine how, for those of you, if there's anyone on this who was here in the early 60s, the campus must have been constantly abuzz with construction because there were just buildings going up all over. So there's our completed Dana Biology Building. And then we get to the Spar Library, which opened its doors in the fall of 1967. So there's our architect's drawing of Spar. And for this one, we even get a nighttime imagining of what the library would look like. And one of the fun things about when they built the Spar Library in the fall of 1967, those of you who were here on campus at the time will remember they did a book walk where they got all the books from the Bosler building into the Spar Library in one day by basically having the students in a chain fashion would pick up a handful of books in the Bosler building, walk them over to the Spar building. And so that the book walk was a very big community sharing project to get us into our new facility. Following next is the first co-ed dormitory, Kisner Woodward, KW. This was the first dorm purpose-built as a co-ed dorm. So one wing of the building was the men's wing, one wing was the women's wing, completed in 1969. And then we got Anita Tuven-Schlechter Auditorium after that. So that's 1971 when that is completed. Some of the greatest construction photos, I think, are associated with ATS because it's such a large building, and the vantage point that they got for some of these shots is really quite fascinating to see. Building of that large structure in that corner of campus. Here's another before it gets its finishing, just looks like a big strange box at that point in time. And right after ATS, then we get the Mckenney Suites, the last of that flurry of dormitory buildings. So here's Mr. and Mrs. Mckenney at the dedication of the building that they helped to pay for. And I threw in another winter shot so that we could remember the cold. And then we're almost done with me running through building explosion and the very busy period of the college's history. Then we get the Klein Center, built during the 1979-1980 year. So that big space becomes our new athletic building because the old Alumni Gymnasium was not big enough anymore. So here's the interior of the space during construction. And some really nice color photos once it was completed and dedicated in the early 1980s. And then once the Klein Center was built, we had to renovate the old Alumni Gymnasium to turn it into the Weiss Center. So this is the old building being gutted, the old Alumni Gymnasium, as it starts to be turned into the Weiss Center for the Arts. And this is one of my favorite pictures in our entire photo collection. This is Truman Bullard and the chamber choir in the gutted building in the space that will eventually become Rubendahl Recital Hall. So I've always thought that was a really fun picture during that process of transforming the old Alumni Gymnasium into a big glare. Now, there we go. this is a very glossy photo with a lot of glare, but there's the nice Weiss Center as completed by 1983. And we're almost there because I'm only coming up to the end of the 20th century. We have the James Center. There was an old church on the corner of College and Lowther Street that the college acquired from the congregation who had left that church. And we turned it into our earth sciences and psychology building. So here we can see the bit of the church with the new addition starting to be added onto it there. And there is a completed James Center named for Ben James that students of many generations will know the name of Ben James, an icon of Dickinson history, if ever there was one. And then finally, I mentioned the Tome name got moved to the new science building. So this building was completed in 1999. So there's one side and there's the other. And that takes us up to the year 2000. And that's where I decided to stop because as it is, I had to rush through quite a bit. So sorry about the speed of all of that, but I want to follow up quickly on the question about the pandemic and what we're doing today. So if you go to the archives website, you'll see in the upper left-hand corner here, the COVID-19 project, share your experiences. So we have been keeping a lot of records as they've been generated by offices all over campus and messages coming out from the president's office and other departments, and maintaining a record of the fact that we've had to have virtual alumni weeks instead of in-person alumni weekends. So all of that we are actively preserving as it's been created, but we're also interested in hearing what the experiences of alumni and others have been from other parts of the world. So we're interested in people sharing photographs, essays, personal accounts, whatever it is that you think would be helpful to share a piece of your life and how your life was affected by the pandemic. You can see here there's a button to share your experiences. It'll take you to a page that will ask you to fill in some personal information, class year, name, things like that. And then you can upload a file. You can just type free text into a field, whatever. But we do want to actively collect about this moment in time because there is so little evidence of the college's experience with the 1918 flu pandemic. So I'm ready for any other questions that people may have.
So Evelyn earlier had something she wanted to talk about Professor Aiken and the stained glass windows. I'm going to allow her to talk so she can ask her question.
Okay.
Can you do that, Evelyn? You'd have to unmute.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Well, you were there maybe still when Professor Aiken was working on campus. Maybe you're familiar with some of the stained glass windows that he did.
Yep.
He had taken a sabbatical at the Pilchuck School of Glass to learn glassmaking in Washington State. And the Pilchuck School is like a mecca for stained glass work. It was founded by Dale Chihuly. And there are not many contemporary artists who are working, designing stained glass windows. A lot of people, it's been just church restoration work. So the windows that are on campus are one of a kind designs, and I feel are significant. I would I've not heard of another college anywhere throughout the country having so many stained glass things that are contemporary designs by a professor. And so, one, I'm concerned that I believe he's around his 90s. And when I had reached out to the archive several years ago, you had no plans or details of his notes or designs. He would have done paper designs of the windows. And I'm wondering if in the last few years that if you have reached out to acquire those for the archives, I think they would be very important for the archives to have.
We will definitely reach out to him. I have not spoken with him since the library moved, since the addition to the library, the Widener Library was created in 1998. But I will definitely reach out to him about that. I know that all of the windows he designed in the various buildings on campus are being maintained, but I don't think there is a formal record of his design of those windows. So that would be a very wonderful thing for us to have. So I will definitely reach out to him about that. Thank you very much for asking.
Yeah, thank you, Evelyn. So one of the next questions was, when was the house that was built between the hub and ATS originally used for? What was it originally used for? You know, that became kind of language housing. I think it's used for dance now and theater.
Oh, the Montgomery House.
Yes.
So that the White House, when I was a student, that was, I think, the Spanish and French language houses. It was first built in the 1830s, and it's been many different things over the years. For many years, it was owned individually by faculty members at Dickinson College, and it has served lots of different purposes. It was even college-owned faculty housing at one point. So yeah, it's been many things, but it has been the home of the theater and dance administrative offices now for, I think, about 20 years. Oh, you're muted, Nancy.
Sorry, I'm on mute. I unmute myself. Sorry about that. What was in the space where the Klein Center was built? Was there something that was demolished where the current Klein Center is?
There had been, because the railroad always ran by there had been a lumber business. And so students of a certain generation will remember a building called the Lumber Yard. That was a general purpose student activities building that was called the Lumber Yard, basically as a nod to the original lumber yard that sat on that site.
Okay. I'm trying to interpret this question. How far away from campus have buildings been part of campus? I know of Dickinson West when class of 81 overflowed and forced class of 79 and 80 away from campus. I think maybe how far did the campus reach? Not going all the way to the farm or.
Right.
But like
so Dickinson West was an outlier example of, you know, because of there being so many students and not having enough dorm space within our existing buildings that for that short period of time, all the way at the end where Lowther Street basically comes to an end, that the college leased that space for a few years. You know, right across the street, what had been the Mckenney shoe building has been our buildings and grounds. They're on Orange Street now for many years. There was a period of time when the college owned a piece of property just past the Army War College along Route 11. They acquired that in the 1960s and held it up until the 1980s. So there was some faculty, visiting faculty housing out there, and students occasionally use that space. The athletic fields now are probably the furthest west that the campus grounds have gone. So for the soccer field and the baseball and softball field, that is probably the westernmost extent of campus. So yeah, I mean, the campus had stayed pretty central to the main part, but there have been those moments when the college leased spaces elsewhere. But yeah, this has basically been our core, where, you know, this is the earliest part of campus, and then growth was naturally happening to the west. And I don't anticipate the college really taking over much more land in this general area than it currently has. The college has acquired a lot of these houses along Lowther Street over the years. But I think the footprint has been pretty coherent, let's say, that the college has tried not to venture too far afield, but
I think, someone was asking, is there a current master plan?
I'm not aware that there is. I remember a master plan being rolled out about 10 years ago that had sort of a 25-year vision built into it. And I don't know to what extent that master plan still guides some of the continuing growth possibilities for the college, or if that plan needs to be revisited. That would be, I usually am dealing with the past instead of the future, so I'm not really sure if there is an ongoing master plan that that senior officers are keeping an eye on.
I would say yes. I would say yes, there's a master plan. Let's see, I was actually going and copying and pasting. People were asking about the illustrated campus map that you're showing, and I just sent a link to where people can have access to it and print it for themselves.
Yes, this is straight from the admissions office's page. That's where we grabbed it from.
Yes, and there's a maps and directions. So I just linked up with that page for everybody else. Okay, so we just had a comment. It'd be interesting to have a presentation that highlights some of the smaller buildings on campus that have been repurposed or demolished to create space for the larger.
Yeah, I definitely focused on all the larger buildings, but when you think about all the small individual houses and all of the things, you know, there's been an infirmary and there's been all kinds of specialty housing, and even many of those houses served more than one purpose over the course of their existence on the campus. The house that's currently the admissions house, the house that is the Asbel Center, that could be its own talk, just talking about all the different houses. There were a number of fraternity houses located where the hub is now that were demolished to make way for the hub. So, and those are all very unique themselves in their design and their appearance. So yeah, that would be a fun talk.
Yeah, that's a great idea for a future talk. There's a few other questions. What happened to the original Penn Tractive land you discussed in the beginning of the presentation?
That lot, I think there's just a parking lot on that space now that is tied to the building next to it that is right on the corner of Bedford and Pomfret Street, but I'm not certain about the ownership of that lot. The college ceased to own that lot pretty early in the 19th century. So
great. Wonderful. Well, I think that covers all the questions we have for today. And thanks, Jim, and thanks everyone who joined us.
Thank you all very much. If anyone ever has any questions that you look for on the archives website and don't find, you can feel free to email us at any time. Our email address is archives@dickinson.edu. So we're happy to answer any questions. And if we don't know, we're always happy to look things up. And as I said, that's how I get to learn something new every day.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day and weekend.